All right, let's get the show started. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. Welcome to InRhythm Lightning Talks. I'm your host, Parag Katkar. I'm the head of consulting practices at InRhythm, and we have several awesome lightning talks lined up for you in the upcoming weeks. Our lightning talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time, and each week, one of our practice area consultants shares their knowledge on evolving technology trends in the industry that will help you keep learning and growing in your career. And this week, William Kingsley, who is an awesome senior Android engineer with us, is going to show us how to migrate to Jetpack Compose. And as you guys know, declarative UI is a mega trend, and both web and mobile are actively adopting to this approach. Jetpack Compose is Google's modern toolkit for building native Android UI. And I'm interested in knowing what are the migrating strategies for Jetpack Compose, which William is going to go over today. So I'm really excited for this talk. Without further ado, let's get it started, William.
Thank you, Parag. Well, let's just dive right into it here. As Parag said, I'll be discussing migrating to Jetpack Compose from the old Vue system. And in today's presentation, we'll be going over two different strategies for accomplishing just that. So without further ado, let's get into it. So before we start discussing strategies that would allow us to migrate to Jetpack Compose, we first have to ask ourselves, well, why should we do this to begin with? Well, Jetpack Compose is Google's latest declarative UI toolkit for Android application development. Compose UI is defined by creating modular, easily reusable, composable functions. So why should we migrate to Jetpack Compose? Well, a team that's looking to migrate may have a few different reasons for choosing to migrate. Google recommends Jetpack Compose for all new applications built on the Android platform moving forward. And this is also true for Wear OS and a few of the other computing platforms that they have. Updating Vue components is very error prone, and it's a rather difficult process for anyone that's ever done it before comparatively to Jetpack Compose. Jetpack Compose views update response to data. So right out of the box, we get data binding that the old Vue system doesn't really provide us with. Tight coupling of activities and fragments within our layouts tends to occur quite often when we're using the Vue system and we're having to manually update data on the fly in response to changes that we may receive from our Vue models. Extra code is needed for writing and creating various components within the Vue system, such as recycler views, list views. Typically, we need to create adapters in different classes. So we're supporting these more advanced layouts. And we don't really need to do that with Jetpack Compose. So it's really nice because Jetpack Compose in this way saves us a lot of time and effort. For larger apps, layout files can become very difficult to manage, and this is especially true for applications that don't utilize a multi-modular architecture. The layout files within your app module can become very, very difficult to manage. You can do so using some naming conventions, but really there's no way of getting around the monolithic growth of that particular layout directory. Separate XML files often need to be created for customizing UI widgets and components that you create with Vue, such as if you were to create a card and you wanted to round the corners of a card, you would more than likely have to create a shape and alter the properties of the shape in order to get the desired effect that you're looking for. This really isn't something we need to do in Compose anymore with built-in shape objects that Compose just provides for us right out of the box. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, developing applications using Compose usually takes less time it usually takes about a third of the time to develop a modern Compose application as compared to the old UI system, just because, simply because there's less code and there's less error introduction that we can make into our code. And it's just a much more simplistic and streamlined process. So let's take a look at some migration strategies. So there are two different ways to integrate Jetpack Compose into an existing Android application. And these are two methods that Google also recommends. Typically, in order to migrate to Jetpack Compose, we're going to do so in two different gradual ways: developing new screens entirely with Jetpack Compose, or taking an existing screen and gradually migrating it to components of that screen. The migration strategy that you choose for your team and Android application may vary, and you may want to ask yourself a few different questions when considering a migration strategy. Some of these questions, any of these questions could be: is there a need to migrate to Jetpack Compose immediately? Does your team have the ability to migrate? Do they have the knowledge base? When should you migrate your application? Jetpack Compose is still rather new. Which migration strategy is best for my team? So before you choose to migrate and choose a migration strategy, these are some things that perhaps you would want to consider. Do note that when migrating to Jetpack Compose, if you have well architected your view model, repository, and data source layers, you shouldn't encounter any necessity to change any of these layers in your application. This is really great because rather than trying to tinker with logic in order to make it adhere to the contract of our view model, Compose should be able to just consume what is already available to our view system, thus saving us a lot more time in development. So let's get a quick overview of these two different migration strategies. So when we're developing a new screen for an existing application, there's some considerations that we might want to make. This is a really great strategy for when applications are actively being developed, or when new screens are being created, and new features are being implemented within our applications. This is because some teams that are actively developing applications may have more resources allocated to them, or you may have more of a need for screens immediately as opposed to an application that's more in a maintenance mode. Jetpack Compose functions can be used interoperatively with Vue, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. This can be accomplished using the Compose Vue class, which is also going to be brought up numerous times in this particular presentation. In the case of a single activity Android application using the navigation component for Vue, we can place our composable functions in existing fragments using Compose Vue, as opposed to completely replacing the navigation component or the use of fragments within an old Vue Android application. This can enable us to convert each view to Compose first without changing the underlying navigation or data source logic within our application, thus keeping the application in a release-ready state. However, when our views are ready to be sent into production, we can remove the root component from our fragments, or even remove our fragments entirely and convert to Compose with all of the subviews being already converted. Taking a look at migrating existing strings to Compose, this is very similar to what I was just describing. This is a really great strategy for when applications are not actively being developed, and when applications are being dedicated fewer resources. This would be a good strategy for, as an example, a legacy application that has few developers maintaining it, or a team of developers that isn't really all that familiar with Compose. This allows for a rather gradual migration approach. It also allows for easier integration of existing tests to ensure UI consistency and function. So if you have any UI tests that you've already applied to your Vue system or your XML files, this would better ensure that those tests are working as you're developing and integrating Compose into your existing application. Like before, we can use the Compose Vue class to integrate composable functions into existing XML files, and we'll see an example of that here shortly. So A quick question that I do want to address is, can we implement Vue components in Compose? And the answer to that question is yes. Occasionally, we may find that we want to implement a Vue component in Compose. To do so, we can use the Android Vue function. This function allows us to use existing Vue or XML layouts in Compose without the need to reconstruct components in Compose. This can be particularly useful when custom UI widgets that would otherwise be difficult to recreate in Compose can be reused. So you can imagine that you may have a very, very complex calendar widget, for example, that you've created using XML layouts, and you don't really want to create or recreate using Jetpack Compose. So rather, we can just use the Android Vue function and render that XML file as a composable function using this particular method. This can save a lot of time in development and a lot of unnecessary coding, and thus saving a lot of money in the long run. So let's take a deeper dive into developing a new screen entirely with Compose. Let's see what that entitles. So before we get into Compose, let's take a look at the historic way in which we've developed UI for Fragments. As an example, this is just a screenshot of a typical single-page Android application using the Vue navigation component, and of course using Fragments. For this particular application that I created, it had 3 fragments, each of which with a unique UI. Here, in this particular example, this fragment uses an old XML layout to render for the purpose of rendering its UI. And we can also see some data binding in here for anyone who's familiar with Kotlin syntax. We can see a lot going on within the onCreate view of this particular fragment. Typically, when we're migrating to Jetpack Compose, as stated earlier, we want to replace the root elements last. So for this particular example, I won't be replacing the create view function, but rather we're going to be gradually replacing the contents of that particular function. So let's take a look at what this onCreate view function could look like using Compose. And it's rather simplistic. As you can see within the body of the onCreate view function now, we simply use the Compose view class, as I've stated before, providing it with context, using the apply scope function. And all we need to do is use the set content trailing lambda function. And within that function, we simply provide our composable function that we want to create for this particular fragment. It really is as easy as that. If we wanted to, for example, provide state to our composable, say we have a view model instantiated within our fragment somewhere, we can just do so by providing that state to our composable function, whether that be by passing an instance of or reference of our view model directly as a parameter into our composable function, or just by exposing a few properties of that view model as arguments to our composable function. Either approach would work. It just would simply depend on your use case. But this is all we really have to do in order to include Compose into our existing applications. And as a bonus, we don't need to implement data binding, and that saves us on a lot of lines of code and a lot of logic that we don't need to try to read through or understand in order to maintain our applications. So let's take a look at this thing called hybrid Compose view fragments, or hybrid layouts, as I like to refer to them as. We can create hybrid UI utilizing the Compose view class within XML files. Why would you want to do that? Well, let's take a look at this particular example. Here in the notifications view, I've created a fragment and I've created a hybrid view. It implements view UI and composable components. This example illustrates the interoperability of Vue and Compose. It is this interoperability that enables component-wise migrations or the migration of components in existing screens, as I'll show in just a moment. So in this particular example, you can use hybrid views to replace all of the XML components within an XML layout file without yet replacing the root, in this case, the constraint layout component of our layout. You may find that in some use cases and some business logic cases that this may be desirable if you're doing any manipulation of your root layout. And that's why I've chosen to include hybrid layouts within this particular strategy. However, this is also how we can achieve migrating components of our UI, as we'll see in just a moment. So in our example here, in my screenshot, this is nothing more than just an XML layout file that for the notifications fragment. This XML layout implements the constraint layout, a text view, and a compose view class that enables developers to create hybrid UI. So with that in mind, let's take a look at migrating existing screens to using Jetpack Compose and their components. So to accomplish this, all we really need are hybrid layouts, as we've seen before. As before, we just use a hybrid UI to support the replacement of view components with Compose. And we replace these components by just using the Compose view class that we can see within this XML screenshot example. Here, in this particular example, I've replaced the events text and past events list with composable functions. And we can see an example of that in our XML layout file. It is the third component of this particular layout, where we can see the use of a compose view class. So let's take a look at what this looks like in our fragment. Well, in order to provide our compose view class a layout to render to our screen, we actually need to use the find by ID function to get the ID of the compose view. This is going to look very, very similar to anyone who's done any type of XML layout view manipulation. The find view by ID function tends to be used quite often, quite a lot. Once we have our compose view acquired by the ID of the compose view component, we simply just call set content on that particular compose view component. And in this case, I'm just providing a compose event title, which is a custom composable function that I've created, but I've obfuscated here just for brevity. And below, we can also see the composable list compose view component. And again, I just created a custom compose event list layout. If we wanted to expose data from our view model or state to our composable functions, this is done the same way that we would when replacing an entire view with a composable function. And that's really it. Using compose view, we can replace old UI components with new composable functions. Once the screen's components are replaced, we can then replace the fragment and view navigation with compose screens and compose navigation. That's really all you need to do. It doesn't really get much more complex than that. And of course, this is a simple example using a single page Android application in the view navigation system. But you can extend this to really any Android application, whether it be an Android application that uses multiple activities or multiple fragments within multiple activities. This is all there really is to it. It provides a lot of flexibility for us to migrate to Compose while also maintaining the integrity, maintainability, and readability of our applications. And I dare say improving them, because we're now removing a lot of the complexity that the view system provides us with and simplifying it with Jetpack Compose. So in conclusion for this talk, Jetpack Compose and views are interoperable, which is really great for anyone looking to reuse any type of view components that they've already created and don't really feel like recreating. Your team's migration strategy depends on the team and application. Developing new screens entirely with Compose is great for quick migrations and actively developed applications. Migrating existing screen components is a good approach for more gradual migrations and as a learning opportunity. Google's migration documentation is a really great resource for supporting migrations. And for anyone out there who's looking to migrate, I would highly suggest looking at Google's documentation. It can really answer any questions that you may have and just reiterates this approach that I presented today. Vue will continue to be supported for the immediate future, but new Android applications should really use Compose. And to reiterate, Jetpack Compose is the future. Custom Vue widgets can be reused. And again, this saves us a lot of time with the use of interoperability. So included in this presentation are a few useful links. I've included documentation to Google's migration strategies, as well as Medium articles that I think do a little better job of breaking it down. And with that, is there any questions?
Hey, William, awesome talk. So only one question. I guess, like, at any point in the future, do you think the old Vue system will be completely deprecated and like just considered completely legacy?
That's a great question. And Google hasn't, to my knowledge, said when they are going to discontinue support for the old Vue system. That being said, I would imagine it's probably only going to be another 5 to 10 years that the Vue system is supported for, simply because of the numerous benefits that Jetpack Compose can provide us with. So while yes, Vue is going to be continued to be supported by Google, it really is highly recommended that you start looking at migration and give your developers the opportunity to start learning on Jetpack Compose.
Cool. And is Jetpack Compose actually built on top of the old Vue system? Like, so with Swift UI, it's built on top of UI, kind of like as an extra layer of abstraction. Is that true for Jetpack Compose, or is it a completely different system?
I do believe that it's a completely different system. And it's the reason why it's a completely different system is because of the reactive or declarative nature of Compose. It is made in such a way that it has to be, individual composable functions have to be re-rendered when in response to data that may be exposed by our Vue models. And the Vue system simply cannot support that type of behavior. So I do believe it is its own unique system in that respect.
Got it. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, great talk. Thanks.
Yeah, I got a question. So how mature is this? How mature is its ecosystem at this point of time? First question. And second, is this something can be used in combination with old XML technique of Android development?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, Jetpack Compose is production ready. They are on currently release 1.2.0 of the library. So it can be used in enterprise applications, any type of production application, really. However, it is missing a number of components that you may find that you have to implement in Vue, such as web views. That's a big item that is not yet implemented in Compose. So depending on your readiness to migrate to Compose, you may find that you want to wait like another year or two when those components are actually implemented in native in the library, as opposed to going out and using some third parties or implementing the old Vue systems components for that. And yes, using to answer your second question, you can use interoperability to achieve the same style of programming that you would using the old Vue system or XML layouts. But keep in mind, there's some functional differences between XML layouts and Compose. So you'll find that it's probably not a one-to-one comparison.
Got it. Cool. Thanks.
Any other questions? Well, if not, then first of all, thank you, William, for an amazing talk, very informative. And as a reminder to you all, we do these talks every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And next week, Wei Fei, who is an awesome senior software engineer with us, is going to give an overview of web bundling alternatives. And I'm really looking forward to this talk. So make sure you mark your calendar for next week. And thank you all once again for joining. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all next week.